The time has finally come. After years of anticipation, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 9, The JOJOLands, is officially here, debuting in this month's issue of Ultra Jump with a staggering 70-page chapter. Like many of you watching, this is going to be my first time experiencing a part of JoJo from the beginning, and I couldn't be more excited. So together, let's embark into a new era of JoJo with my first JoJoLands chapter review, starting with Chapter 1, Mechanism. The cover of Ultra Jump this month, of course, features the new JoJo with the artwork we discussed in my last video, celebrating the beginning of a new part as well as JoJo's return to the magazine, as during JOJOLands serialization, it was Ultra Jump's flagship series, being featured on the cover nearly every month in the later years of its run. So throughout the JoJoLands, I'd expect it to be featured on the cover of the magazine quite often. So onto the first page of the chapter, we begin with an introduction to stands. I'm not sure if this is an official page of the JoJoLands or just something specifically for its magazine release to introduce new readers to the concept of stands who may be unfamiliar with the series, as it's been out of serialization for over a year and a half, and new parts are usually always written in a way that assumes the reader is already familiar with stands, as it could get redundant if at the beginning of every part we needed to go through a big long explanation of what these things are. So Araki just shows us a few that some people might be like, oh, Killer Queen, I know what that is. Okay, stands, we're good, this is JoJo. So the page tells us that stands are powers that have forms and shapes but are invisible. They exist all over and always have, but are simply unseen by those who do not try and see them. So the text here I don't believe is meant to be taken literally, as we know in the world of JoJo, stands can only be seen by other stand users. What I think Araki is saying with this sentiment is that stands are the curiosities of the world, the unexplained or phenomenon we experience in everyday life that when truly observed can fill your life with ideas and interest, as pretty much every stand is based on the concept of some mundane normality that is often overlooked or obscured by familiarity. Just looking at the stands Araki drew for this page, what are some of the bases for their abilities? Soap bubbles, rotations, discs, shadows, string, time, words, things that everyone has seen before or have become so familiar with, we never think twice about them. And this idea of maintaining curiosity even within the humdrum of everyday life is what JoJo is all about, and how there is magic and beauty in everything. Here's a quote from Araki's book, Manga in Theory and Practice, from the section Ideas Are Limitless. Writing, good ideas come from one's life experience. Losing interest in the world means losing the ability to come up with ideas. If you're always able to maintain interest in something and keep your antenna poised to pick up on and react with openness to the occurrences around you, you won't run out of ideas. So think of this opening word on stands as Araki's philosophy for how he writes them and comes up with ideas. They exist all over and always have, but they are simply unseen by those that do not try and see them. And this philosophy also applies to a concept that is brought up later in this chapter, being the chapter's title, Mechanism, which so far seems to have the potential to be a power adjacent to stands. Okay, so to finally get into this chapter now, it turns out the preview page we saw in fact was the first page of the JoJoLands, as we now see the double page spread in full color introducing us to the new JoJo, setting, and chapter title. And like Steel Ball Run and JOJOLion stating their part's intention right in the beginning, being a story of learning how to walk again and a story about breaking a curse, the JoJoLands is the story of one boy becoming rich in the subtropical islands. And that boy's name is Jodio Joestar. So while I did predict this character was going to be an alternate Giorno and have the same name, let's call it close enough. So Jodio, that is the name of our new JoJo, and it's been a few days now and I still haven't gotten fully used to it, but I'm sure it'll grow on me and feel more natural as we continue the part. But I think for now, if you just say it fast enough, it sounds like an actual name instead of just JoJo and Dio put together, so I just call him Jodio. So in my last video, I mentioned how if Araki were to recreate Giorno in the alternate universe, he would have to have some sort of Dio in him to really feel like Giorno. And I guess Jodio does technically have Dio in his name, so close enough. Although later on in this chapter, we will have a larger discussion about the family tree and Jodio's nature. So Hawaii is in fact our setting, as many predicted, as we see Jodio and the soon-to-be introduced Dragona sailing their boat towards an erupting volcano, which is followed by the first scene of the manga, where Jodio and Dragona are pulled over by some Honolulu police officers while driving near Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. And within this first scene, Araki pulls no punches, depicting scenes of police brutality and misconduct, sexual assault, race, destroys gender, mentions COVID, and has plenty of standability causing body horror. So right in the beginning of the JoJoLands, it seems Araki is touching on some of the relevant social issues within the past few years, as during the years of 2020 until now, Araki was writing the climax of JoJoLion's Endless Calamity and was unable to depict such issues or experiences from his everyday life within that part of the story. And as we know, Araki draws inspiration from the world world around him, as if you remember last year, he wrote a Rohan episode that was literally about a mangaka lacking inspiration because of COVID restrictions, which really felt like Araki blowing off steam and lamenting his feelings. So I'm sure Araki wasn't oblivious to social issues within the past few years. It may have even interested him to some capacity, as this part takes place in America around present day with the first scene depicting some pretty sensitive subjects. And I'm not saying the writing is political in any way, simply that Araki likes to draw the things he sees in the world. It's where he finds his motivation, so there could be a connection there considering the part's time period. Right now, I'd say this part takes place anywhere in between 2021 and present day. As Jodio had mentioned, they were listening to Dua Lipa, so the first musical reference of the JOJOLands being Dua Lipa is a massive W, as well as shortly after this, Dragona tells the police officer he's too close and he's worried about COVID. But we see that no one is wearing a mask, and later on, businesses and schools are open without any restrictions, so the time period is most likely closer to present day. So let's just say 2022 to be safe, as that's the time when Araki did most of his planning for part 9. So that makes Jodio Joestar our first Zoomer JoJo, confirmed to be 15 years old, born in 2007, the same year that Halo 3 came out on the Xbox 360. So Jodio would have been around 4 years old during the events of JoJoLand, and he also would have been around 11 years old when Fortnite Battle Royale came out. So this boy was most definitely a Fortnite kid, knows how to default dance, and has a Discord account. But alongside Jodio in this part is a concept that fans have been clamoring for years, and it's the idea of two main protagonists who are both Joestars and siblings. Preferably twins, but this is close enough, as although Jodio is set up as our main JoJo, alongside him this entire chapter is his big brother Dragona, who is 18 years old. And yes, that's right, despite Dragona's appearance, he is a guy, and so far I would assume identifies as male from what we see in this chapter. Although since the release, there has been a bit of confusion surrounding this character. So Dragona, while appearing as a woman, was in fact born a man, revealed to have a dick and balls when being assaulted by the police officer, and later on in the chapter, Jodio explains why Dragona appears feminine, saying he loves girl-like fashion and takes cosmetic injections to make his chest swell. So the question has been if Dragona is a transgender character or not, as while it appears they are, Jodio always refers to Dragona as his big brother and with male pronouns, although apparently, from my understanding, masculine and feminine pronouns are more complicated in Japanese, and even the translators are not 100% sure of Araki's intentions with Dragona. So what we know about Dragona is purely from Jodio's perspective, so that should be taken into consideration, as from his understanding, Dragona is a man who identifies as a man but presents himself as feminine, or maybe that's not even his intention. He could just be enjoying women's clothing and having boobs while still being completely comfortable with his gender assigned at birth, and not necessarily trying to pass as a woman, but just dresses and looks in a way that makes him feel good. As Jodio says, his injections are for cosmetic reasons, but if he was using hormone replacement therapy, that changes more than just cosmetics. But again, this is just Jodio's perspective, so if Araki does intend on having Dragona be a transgender character, that may happen later in the story when we hear directly from Dragona themselves about how they feel inside and why they present themselves as feminine. So for now, I would just suggest not to label this character as anything they're not, and just wait to see more if Dragona does have an arc that explores gender identity as part of their development. As even if this is all we ever get explained about Dragona, I wouldn't be surprised, as Araki has expressed many times before that there is no difference between male and female characters, and gender does not define how a character should behave. So we really shouldn't be surprised at this point that Araki has made an androgynous character when he's done it plenty of times in the past, as Dragona could just be a representation that gender doesn't define you, so it's purposefully left ambiguous. So back to the chapter, within this first scene, Jodio and Dragona encounter some corrupt police officers who pull them over and use their authority to take advantage of Dragona, and make it clear that they feel because of their status as police officers, they are able to essentially do whatever they want free of consequences because of how their system works. Although Jodio, realizing what's going on, steps out of the truck, ignoring the officer's warnings, and gives us our first look at his full design, which is absolute fire, as we can see his chest piece is connected to his pants, more like a pair of overalls with openings on the sides, and the bottom of his pants flare out, giving him a cool 70s rock star look, which from the front has a silhouette similar to Johnny with short sleeves and a hood. So when seeing Dragona in danger, Jodio activates his stand, which is in fact named November Rain, as we predicted before the chapter released from his design. So the stand is pretty big and appears over Jodio with a similar design to Doggy Style and Fun, with the stand's main body being just a torso with its arms extending well below its body, with the base of the stand looking like a drill or funnel, which may be the source of the rain droplets. So when the rain produced by November Rain touches the police officer, it immediately pins him to the ground and creates craters all over his body where the rain falls, with the water pooling inside the craters. And we then see the same ability used on the other officer, so it looks like the rain is extremely heavy, as it forces its targets to the ground with enough force to indent the skin and bone. Although the effect also appears similar to the stand vitamin C, which was able to make someone's body extremely soft, almost like they were melting, as November rain's droplets create a similar effect. And when we see Jodio recall his stand ability, or at least from how it looks, the skin goes back to normal. So from how we see the stand used in this scene, my first impression was actually that the ability was way too one-dimensional for a main JoJo, who is the character that will be in the most fights during the part and usually has the most dynamic stand, as the stand itself does not have a humanoid body with arms and legs to perform a stand rush. And if the stand doesn't change or evolve over time, that would make Jodio the only main JoJo, besides Joseph and Jonathan, without a humanoid type stand. So right now, I'm a little concerned, as the rainfall we saw in this chapter was not a very dynamic attack that doesn't require any movement from the stand or the user. It just appeared over top of the target, which could get a bit repetitive over time if that's its only means of attacking. Although I'm sure that this is just a small glimpse into the stand's real ability and the various ways Jodio can use it, especially if the part at some point is going to incorporate sailing. I'm sure having a stand that can create rain and manipulate the weather in some way would be pretty handy. So I doubt this is the only effect the rain can cause. Say for example, November Rain's ability was to produce rain with different properties, and what we saw here was him making the rain heavy, which allowed him to detain the officers. So maybe he could also make rain that is hot, cold, slick like oil, sharp, loud, and just have different properties to make the stand more diverse. Similar to how Josuke from Part 8's soap bubbles were an empty vessel to store properties from the world around him to use to his advantage. As if you notice, right before Jodio activates November Rain, he reaches out with his left arm and he touches the truck, possibly applying the weight of the truck to his rain droplets, which then pin the officers to the ground. Also during this scene, used alongside November Rain, was Dragona's Smooth Operators, a colony type stand which allows Dragona to distort or rearrange anything he touches, as he wipes his hand across the officer, warping his face, and then later we see he used his stand to rearrange the numbers on the license plate and the image of the stolen license. The ability sort of reminds me of how Crazy Diamond in the beginning of Part 4 would sometimes restore things in an incorrect way, like Jotaro's hat in the bully's face, although it can also change things accurately, but can't create something entirely new. For example, it was just moving the numbers around the license plate, and the driver's license itself was originally a girl that looked like Dragona, and he used the stand to just distort the image to look more like him. Kinda like Photoshop in real life, where you see people create something new from an original image using warping tools, distortions, and blending. And this ability could also provide some insight into Dragona's character, as stands are often a reflection of their user's personality, nature, or some strong emotion within them. So it seems Dragona has an innate desire or feels strong emotions about rearranging or changing things, and as we've seen, they physically alter their body to look more like a woman, so this all may be more relevant when we learn more about the character later in the part. So after this fight with the police, it's pretty heavily established that Jodio and Dragona are straight up criminals, Jodio specifically being an absolute menace, as he burns the cop car, destroys all of the video evidence on the dash cam and the body cams after beating the ever-living shit out of these cops, which was 100% justified by the way, and following this, we see that they were actually driving a stolen truck and were transporting a shit ton of drugs within the surfboards in the back, being gophers for a larger criminal organization. This then leads into a narration from Jodio introducing us to his mother, Barbara Ann, whose name is in reference to the Beach Boys song of the same name, describing her as a good mother and hard worker who is respected by the men and children within their community. Because of the actions taken by Jodio and Dragona, their mother is taken care of. People tell her good morning, they offer to carry her bags, and when it rains, there is always someone there to hold an umbrella, because her children protect her and ensure her social safety from behind the scenes, whether it's because they are paying these people, threatening them with violence, or it could be a way of paying debt. This concept of Barbara having a guardian angel is a recreation of Giorno's guardian angel from Part 5, a member of Passione who looked over Giorno when he was a child and ensured his safety from behind the scenes using criminal methods. This then leads into Jodio's description of his brother, which we talked about earlier, and then we see the family tree, which I really wasn't expecting to see in the first chapter, but here it is, and we can see that Barbara Ann is the daughter of Joseph Joestar, who met an unnamed man that is the father of both Jodio and Dragona. And although the father is anonymous, I am almost certain that at some point in the JoJoLands, their father will be revealed or be an important plot point, as he is 99.9999% probably a descendant of the Brando bloodline, and possibly even a descendant of Diego himself if he was able to impregnate someone before he died in Part 7. Because this man's name is literally Jodio, so there is no way his father is just a random guy, and the fact that Jodio's personality is pretty much a mix between Dio, Jotaro, and Joseph, so something to look forward to in the future. The chapter then skips forward in time a bit, presumably the next day or something, where we see Jodio riding the bus and him lose his temper on an upperclassman who tries to give him money. We later see that the student, who was the hot dog man from the preview, who everyone was excited about, was trying to give Jodio money for for drugs, as the transaction later happens on the school grounds, with the drugs being dead dropped in a nearby rain gutter. All during this scene, Jodio is providing an inner monologue and narration about his intentions at school, saying he isn't there particularly to learn or make friends, rather he's at school for the mechanism, which brings the chapter title into relevance. This leads into what I believe is the introduction to the theme of the JOJOLands and the particular philosophy or concept Araki is going to explore throughout this part, which is mechanisms. Describing mechanisms as something which have power but are invisible to the eyes. With them, even if you have enemies, you'll already be winning from the start. Mechanisms may be taken or destroyed sometimes, but it's a general principle of the world that they bring you wealth. The pinnacle of mechanisms is something Jodio can't yet see, but believes those mechanisms will come to appear before us as forms and shapes. Jodio has observed mechanisms and their power. For example, his job as a gopher, simply transporting things and handing them over, while being diligent and not speaking more than he has created a mechanism of trust and power. And through this mechanism, it's the reason why someone just as strong, smart, and wealthy as Jodio will be bullied and have to quit school. Meanwhile, he lives like this, and sometimes more like this. And let's just take a moment to appreciate Jodio's swag in these pages, doing a little torture dance all blinged out and drinking champagne surrounded by girls. This guy is just the best JoJo already. So while this is a story of Jodio becoming filthy rich, the concept of rich does include money, but also something far more important than that: mechanisms. So what are these mechanisms Jodio is talking about? Right now, it's far too early to see Araki's full vision of this concept, but it's clearly something within the world Araki has noticed and decided to depict within his work. A force of the world which exists but cannot be seen, just like every other theme he's explored in the past, such as fate, gravity, time, miracles, curses, and the flows of positive and negative energy. So I'm confident that the idea of mechanisms relates to these previous concepts, as it's Jodio's goal to discover and use these mechanisms in order to become filthy rich. During this monologue, Jodio says that he prefers the word mechanism over system, which gives us a general idea of what he's talking about, a set of principles or procedures in which something is achieved. And since Jodio is particular about the word, a mechanism by definition is a natural or established process by which something takes place or is brought about. So like the natural mechanisms within the world, such as the way plants grow and nourish through the mechanism of photosynthesis and the mechanisms created by man, such as machines and computers, and if you notice the artwork behind this narration, it's things like plants, ocean tides, and erupting volcanoes. Natural processes within nature that, without the influence of mankind, just work through a sequence of connected components. So the mechanism Jodio is seeking, I believe, utilizes flows of energy as well as decisions made by Jodio as its components to create an overwhelmingly positive result. For example, let's go back to JOJOLian and see how Norisuke described the flow of business for his fruit parlor in Morio. Norisuke had thoughtfully located his fruit parlor to create the perfect flow of business, being near the train station, surrounded by shopping boutiques with a dining area located on the second floor, perfect for tired shoppers to stop in for a light treat with a view of the city. And through this flow of business, Norisuke had accumulated a great wealth. So this system Norisuke has created isn't tangible, but it still exists, and all of the components, being the location, customers, the fruit, the view from the second floor, and people's habits of working up an appetite after a shopping spree, are all parts in the mechanism which require all of the parts to work together to create its results, being a successful fruit parlor. Even the parfait Norisuke makes for Josuke can be seen as a mechanism, as the shape of the glass, the layering of all the different components, the ingredients, and the scooping technique are all parts of the mechanism which create a positive outcome. Just another example of how we can observe the concept of mechanisms. Even this manga, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, can be described as a mechanism, as each part individually is fine in its own right, but what really makes the series special and overwhelmingly positive is the 9 parts all working together. But coming back to the JoJoLands, Jodio had described his job of being a gopher and his own behavior as working together to create a mechanism of trust. Being that he was able to do his job well and not speak more than he has to, these components have created a mechanism for Jodio to accumulate decent pocket money and trust among his employers. So with a basic understanding of how things can work together to provide positive results, I assume Jodio has recognized the power of the mechanism and is on a mission to create the ultimate mechanism, to live his life in a way and use the world around him to create a mechanism which will make him filthy rich, which will most likely take time, experience, and many failures, as he is still very young and coming to understand what makes a mechanism work. The mechanism is mentioned again near the end of the chapter when Jodio, Dragona, and Paco are forced to team up with a strange classmate in an upcoming heist, and Jodio thinks, is this another of the world's mechanisms? When you make a team, you always get one oddball, which I think further defines mechanisms as natural flows, something unavoidable or with predictable outcomes, connecting the mechanism to fate in a way, as the world around you is also in itself a mechanism, and understanding the mechanisms around you can result in an accumulation of wealth, as in a way, understanding mechanisms can predict the future, like Norisuke's fruit parlor. Interestingly, Jodio also says that the mechanisms will come to appear before us as forms and shapes, which is how stands were described at the beginning of the chapter, and it's entirely possible in the alternate universe for stands to manifest from energy itself, such as Ballbreaker being a stand created as a result of the energy from the golden spin, a phenomenon found in nature. You could even think of the spin itself as a mechanism, and the pinnacle of that mechanism would be the golden spin, as it requires so many things to work together in order to achieve that ultimate outcome of an infinite rotation, which manifested in a physical form, and Jodio says that the pinnacle of mechanisms are something that he can't yet see, but they eventually will appear before him. So I could see the possibility of Jodio's ultimate mechanism and intersecting positive flows eventually manifesting in a physical form of some kind or attaching to his stand. But as I mentioned earlier, it's far too early to see Araki's full vision and where he's going to go with this concept of mechanisms and what the truth is behind them. So this is my current idea with my understanding of how he's written the alternate universe so far and how it could connect to the previous parts, but we'll just have to wait and see where this goes. So continuing on in the chapter, following the mechanism section and transitioning into a new scene, is the introduction to another new character, being the man who was working with Jodio to sell drugs earlier at school, Paco Lovelantis, who during his introduction, I feel like is Araki trolling the readers a bit, reminiscent of the gag he played with Mikitaka in part 4. As within Paco's description, there is more than a few characteristics which call back to the rock humans from JOJOLands, which just seems way too intentional to be a coincidence. First off, his body is described as being chiseled like a rock. Then Jodio says he doesn't get the idea that him and Paco are friends or anything, even though they work together, and that Paco went missing for a year and is still in school despite being 19. As Jodio says he was chubby 2 years ago, then he didn't see him for a year, but now he's shredded, but he doesn't get the idea that he went off to study abroad or anything, possibly going into a long hibernation, feeding off of his body weight during the year. Paco also has a scar on his left ear from supposedly domestic abuse, although normally when a human's wound heals, they will try to reshape themselves and smooth the edges of wounds, but Paco's ear just looks like a chipped piece of a statue reminiscent of the wound sustained by rock humans. And lastly, Paco is described as a kleptomaniac and low-life thief, so with all of these very specific details compounding, it seems like Araki is very clearly trying to make the reader question Paco's nature, for reasons that might be relevant later in the story or simply to call back to JOJOLands, as I could see Paco being a Mikitaka situation where it's always a question if he's a rock human or not, but it's never directly addressed, just a running gag, as the only thing to absolve Paco of the rock human allegations so far is that it's mentioned he has a father, which could of course not be true, or he was adopted or something. Paco is also a stand user, now being in the running for the worst stand in the series, as his stand The Hustle allows him to contort his muscles to grab onto things like he's sticking things around his body, which aids in his kleptomania, which I'm sure will be used in some supporting role to trick people over, but so far, the stand really isn't that much more impressive than simple sleight of hand. This scene is happening at the Eco boutique mentioned earlier, which Dragona works at, as we see him catch Paco stealing and uses smooth operators to pull on his ear, which shows us that all of these characters already know each other. So at the shop right now is Jodio, Dragona, and Paco, but also comes barreling in as their school principal seen earlier being the 7-foot-tall Meryl May Q, who turns out to also be the group's boss and proprietress of Eco, which is a front for money laundering to support Meryl May Q's true job, which is crime and theft, as she presents her trusted group with a new job, so we can see that these three have a history working together with Meryl, and they're sort of an underground criminal gang. So the job is stealing a 24-karat diamond appraised at $6 million. The diamond was found through Meryl May's connections at the customs department in the airport, who found the diamond in the luggage of a Japanese tourist who will be staying in a nearby villa for about 12 days. And for this job, Meryl also brings in another person, being the wetsuit guy from earlier, who for some reason Meryl believes will be beneficial for the job, so he's most likely a stand user, even though we don't see it in this chapter. So a simple enough job for a group of stand users: break into the villa and steal the diamond. Although Jodio's narration at the end of the chapter tells us their boss did call one thing right: just the three of us would seriously have not been enough. Actually, it wouldn't have been enough no matter how many people we had. And the chapter then ends showing us again the stands we had seen throughout it, including November Rain, Smooth Operators, and The Hustle, which all have their own little symbols found on their user's design, which make me think this is probably our main cast. So an absolute banger of a chapter to kick off the JOJOLands, which gives us a really solid idea of this part's tone. Of course, Jodio is an alternate Giorno, but it also looks like the plot of the JOJOLands is similar to part 5, with the main cast being a sort of criminal gang with a boss Meryl May, who also reminds me a lot of Pulpo from part 5, being this larger-than-life character who is an important capo, or at least a big deal criminal. And so far, the setup for the JOJOLands could make this the most fun part of JoJo to date, as who wouldn't want to see a heist story with Stan? It's just perfect, as it looks like the first arc of this story will be a heist for the diamond. But of course, the burning question at the end of this chapter is who is the Japanese tourist, as it is almost certainly going to be a character or relative of someone from JoJolion, as this appears to be an alternate Golden Wind, and in part 5, the story begins with a resident of Morio coming to a far-off land and having their property stolen by Giorno. And so far in part 9, it's being set up in the same way. So I know a lot of people would like to see Josuke return, being our previous main JoJo, and I do think that is possible, as he could be investigating his relatives similar to what Jotaro was doing in part 5, as well as the fact that Jodio said it wouldn't have been enough no matter how many people we had. So we know their heist is going to go south at some point, and that this individual is extremely powerful, as I'm sure Josuke with Go Beyond could handle a few delinquents easily. But if a fight is going to go down between this one Japanese character and our main cast so far, I feel like Josuke is a more unlikely candidate, as his ability Go Beyond was specifically to overcome Wonder of Useful of Calamity, so against anyone else it just wouldn't make sense. As well as I think we've seen enough from Josuke's Soft and Wet throughout JoJolion, but don't get me wrong, I would still like to see him at some point and see what he's up to now that it's been 11 or 12 years after JoJolion. I just don't really see what sort of mentor role he could fulfill to Jodio. More likely I think is Joshu, Yasuo, or Tsurugi. Joshu just because it would fit his character to always be carrying an expensive diamond wherever he traveled, although I think the diamond is going to serve more relevance than just being an expensive jewel. So Yasuo is also a possibility, as she could be in a more investigative role later in life, similar to Koichi from part 5 and Lucy Steele after part 7. Being so heavily affected by the Rokakaka and Toru, I doubt she would go back to just her normal school life, where she felt like she lacked a purpose. So maybe now, later in life, she is more involved with the Speedwagon Foundation or has continued to investigate stands and the natural phenomenon after part 8, and maybe even has a vendetta against rock humans or something, and is going around the world seeking them out. But I admit that theory is a bit too specific, so I doubt that'll happen. And lastly, I mentioned Tsurugi. I can't really see why Tsurugi would be going to Hawaii alone with a $6 million diamond, because the last time we saw him, he was 10, but I just really want to see that character grown up, as he would be around 21 or 22 during part 9, and maybe even his stand has evolved over time or from his exchange with Toru. As the way Jodio said, it wouldn't have mattered no matter how many people we had, immediately made me think of Tsurugi and his ability to make people's faces look the same, and in some cases distort people's perceptions of reality. So unlike the other characters who would have just been able to fight a lot of people at once, I think Tsurugi's Paper Moon Cane truly would be able to defeat a group of enemies no matter how many there were, as his stand would make everyone unable to tell friend from foe. And I doubt this first arc with the entire main cast is going to end with them getting their asses beaten down by one individual character. So Paper Moon Cane's ability would be able to defeat the group without trying to kill them. And I really just want to see that character design of a 21-year-old Tsurugi, and I know he would just look really awesome and maybe even resemble Jobin a bit. So that is the JoJoLands Chapter 1 Mechanism. Honestly, this may just be rose-colored glasses, but this is one of, if not the best first chapter of a JoJo part to date. Of course, it has a bit of an advantage, also being the longest first chapter, which gave us a ton of characterization to the main JoJo, the supporting cast, the part's mission statement, introduction to the theme of mechanisms, and setup for the plot and the first arc, with an excellent cliffhanger, being the potential of a returning character from JoJolion, as well as a stand heist. So really, just what more could you ask for from one chapter? So of course, cannot wait for the next chapter, but I'm really just excited for the potential that this part has, as so far, from this first chapter, I truly believe this could be the pinnacle of Araki's work, and I'm so excited to review every single chapter and go on this journey with you guys for the foreseeable future. Also, if you guys are interested in seeing my live reactions to the chapters, including chapter 1, be sure to check out my Patreon down below in the description. You don't need to pay for it or subscribe or anything. The videos are uploaded there completely for free. They're just longer and completely unedited. So link in the description if you want to check those out. But thank you all so much for watching. Please be sure to like the video if you enjoyed, and if you're excited to begin the JoJoLands. Subscribe so you don't miss future reviews and future JoJo content, and I'll talk to you guys all real soon. Peace.